This is a continuation of this past Sunday morning on depression. Depression happens so often and affects such a large percentage of the population, it has been called the common cold of mental illness. On an annual basis, depression is estimated to cost more than $23 billion, not million, $23 billion in employee absenteeism and reduced production. It is a serious societal problem. This morning we're going to finish a two-part message on the subject of depression. And this rather intense discussion is based on the biblical character Elijah. From time to time, each of us have struggled with, quote, normal depression. Depression is defined as dejection resulting from a loss, rejection, or disappointment. But the prophet Elijah had this normal depression times about 10. Last time we mentioned a date, 931 BC. On that date in 931 BC, the ancient nation of Israel, consisting of 12 original tribes, was separated into two parts. A northern kingdom consisting of 10 tribes that continued to be called Israel, and then a southern kingdom, a smaller kingdom, consisting of 2 tribes called Judah. This narrative we're reading in 1 Kings 19 transpired during the northern kingdom of Israel, and during the reign of that kingdom's 7th king named Ahab. Ahab and his evil queen wife Jezebel. On Mount Carmel, Elijah had executed 450 prophets that represented a false god named Baal. Jezebel was a Baal worshiper, and because of those executions, Queen Jezebel was so angered and got so upset at Elijah that she put out a contract on his head. That scared Elijah so much, he was so frightened, that he decided to camp out in a remote wilderness area so she couldn't find him. But Elijah was depressed to the point that he was suicidal, and he actually asked God to take his life. Question: how did Elijah rid himself of that depression? What are some of the cures for depression? In Elijah's case, God used 3 strategies. These are God's antidepressants. First strategy: God helped Elijah recuperate from his exhaustion. God helped Elijah recuperate from his exhaustion. Notice 1 Kings 19, starting at verse 5. Then as he lay and slept under a broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." Verse 6, then he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and then lay down again. Verse 7, and the angel of the Lord came back the second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." Verse 8, so he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. Remember from last time, we mentioned that Elijah was totally fatigued. And that fatigue contributed to his depression. So the first thing God did was to give Elijah adequate rest and ample food to help rejuvenate his physiological system. He was completely fatigued and exhausted. So God gave him what he needed in order to regain his strength. There are 3 distinct dimensions to us as human beings. The first one is the physiological dimension, and that means our bodies. Second, there's the psychological dimension, and that means our minds. And third, there is the spiritual dimension. So the 3 dimensions are physiological, psychological, and then spiritual. Each of us has a physiological dimension, a psychological dimension, and a spiritual dimension. And we need to understand that all 3 dimensions are interrelated. All 3 of them are interconnected. And that means each dimension has a direct effect on each of the other dimensions. The fact Elijah was fatigued and exhausted meant that his physiological problem affected both his psychological component and his spiritual component. And the reason is because, as we just said, all three dimensions are interrelated. So God began this healing process for Elijah at the area of his most immediate need, and that was bodily restoration. First, God let him sleep off his fatigue. And then God sent him an angel to prepare him a meal. This angel came, prepared a meal, awakened him. Elijah ate that meal and then went back to sleep. After some time had passed, this angel came a second time, prepared another meal, and Elijah ate a second time. Please notice that this angel prepared him a cake. And I'm curious, what was that particular cake? That's simple. It was angel food cake. That's what it was. I mean, what else could it have been? It wasn't devil's food cake. This was the first area God addressed. God gave Elijah adequate rest and nutrition in order to rejuvenate his physiological system. That maneuver on the part of God reinforces the fact there is a definite connection between sleep loss and mental and emotional fitness. Sleep-deprived people are 14% more apt to report symptoms of psychological stress. One research study indicated that for each hour of lost sleep, levels of psychological distress increase 5%. 5% per each hour of lost sleep. Then a study from Penn State University found men that received less than 6 hours sleep per night were four times more apt to die during the time of that study than did men that slept 7 hours or more. The point is, sleep is important. I read that the top 3 sleep-deprived nations are France, Taiwan, and the United States. Not necessarily in that order. The latest statistics indicate that more than 70 million of us suffer from sleep loss. Of that number, 40 million people suffer from a chronic sleep disorder, such as sleep apnea, and that would be me. And another 30 million have intermittent sleep-related problems. Sleep deprivation is so serious, the insurance company AAA said that 2 out of 5 drivers have at one point in time fallen asleep at the wheel. Those disturbing statistics mean that getting adequate rest is sometimes easier said than done. Some people are confirmed workaholics. And those of us who have a slight propensity toward workaholism are internally programmed to feel guilty about even sitting down and catching our breath. We just cannot stand the thought of doing nothing. A workaholic once told me it's better to burn out than rust out. I didn't understand that because in either case, we're still out. And who wants to be out? I want to hang in there as long as I can. I don't believe it is just permissible to rest. I believe it is essential to rest because resting rejuvenates our psychological and physiological systems. It recharges our batteries and enables us to do more after we rest than we could have done had we not rested. And so it was essential for Elijah. Now understand something. Rest does not necessarily mean to be sedate or completely inactive. Rest does not necessarily mean a cessation of activities, but rest can also mean a change in activities. Don't miss that. Rest doesn't mean we necessarily don't just do nothing, but rest can mean we do something, but a different something, a change in activities. Rest can mean some form of diversion from the more normal and sometimes hectic schedule people have. One of our good friends from California returned from 5 weeks vacationing in Europe, and she was super excited about that trip. Now, sightseeing in Europe, I've never been to Europe. I love history and so much is there. Sounds exciting to me, but not 5 weeks. That would push me over the edge. I prefer micro vacations since it is difficult for me to get into more elongated vacations. Micro vacations can be as small as vacations that are measured in minutes. Small segments of someone's schedules set aside to create a diversion and a break from all the stuff we're doing. It isn't essential to book an Alaskan cruise or a Sandals Resort vacation, and those are great if you can, but it isn't essential. Because we can take a micro vacation measured in minutes or measured in even hours, and it can relieve some of the exhaustion that might be contributing to our depression. For instance, in the 1970s and 80s, I pastored in Southern California. And sometimes if I happened to be in the South Bay of Los Angeles, I would stop off at Palo Verdes. Palo Verdes is on the coast, but more than 30 miles from the fires in Pacific Palisades in that region. I would stop off at Palo Verdes. Palo Verdes was and still is a beautiful, upscale neighborhood. We could never afford to be there. And there were a couple of areas that were secluded spots, and I knew those areas. So I would park the car and walk down to the rocks just beneath the cliffs of Palo Verdes. It would be secluded enough to where basically all you could see would be the coastline and the cliffs and almost no people. I would just sit there on the rocks and close my eyes, and the ocean breeze would hit me in the face. I could literally smell the ocean water. I could hear the waves crashing against the rocks and hear the seagulls around me, and I would just sit there and take it all in. You know, just like here in El Paso. I might only sit there for 15 minutes or so, but I found that short diversion to be extremely therapeutic. It was revigorating. It was a micro vacation. There is a scientific reason behind the blah feeling called Monday morning blues. All of us have felt those blues. One reason some people are sometimes so tired and sluggish on Monday mornings is that our internal biological systems are thrown off from sleeping in on Saturday and Sunday mornings. Medical professionals recommend not to sleep late on weekends, but recommend getting up at or near our normal time, and that can prevent our biological clock from resetting itself. The recommendation is if we do that, and if we want to catch up on some sleep during the weekend, then take a short nap. But if we're suffering from depression, a good first step is to address the physiological dimension, our bodies, rest and recuperate. There's a second thing though. God had provided substantial rest for Elijah. He provided meals for Elijah. He rejuvenated his physiological system. And then notice what happened next. Verse 8. So he, Elijah, arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, this is interesting. The first clue that Elijah was still suffering from depression is in how long it took him to journey from this wilderness area where he was to Horeb. It is estimated the total distance from that wilderness to his ultimate destination at Mount Horeb was around 200 miles. Think through that. It took him a total of 40 days and nights to complete that journey. But 40 days and nights divided into 200 miles is only 5 miles per day. If the ground surface is conducive to walking, and if someone is in reasonable shape, then he should be able to do 4 miles an hour or slightly more. But Elijah only traveled 5 miles per day. And that was an indication that he was still not emotionally motivated, because he could have easily made that journey in 7 to 10 days if he had wanted to. But he wasn't motivated. He didn't, because he was still depressed. That means in doing what we need to do to our bodies to help it recover is extremely important, but there is still more to do. A second strategy. Notice God allowed Elijah to share his feelings in a non-judgmental setting. God permitted Elijah to share his feelings in a non-judgmental setting. God permitted him to share his sincere and honest feelings about his situation. Notice, starting at verse 9. And there he went into a cave, meaning once he had arrived at his destination, he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, God said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? Verse 10. So he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. Notice he made this statement, I alone am left. It's just me, and they seek to take my life. Verse 11, then he said, God said, go out and stand before the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountain and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. Verse 12, and after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. Verse 13, so it was, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle. His mantle would have been his outer garment, sort of a coat-like garment. He wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Verse 14, and he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with a sword. I alone am left, and I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. Meaning, it's just me, God. I'm the only one left, and Jezebel wants me dead. Notice how God permitted Elijah to vent his feelings and his frustrations in a non-judgmental environment. Psychologists teach us that anger and depression are connected. Don't miss that. Anger and depression are connected. One author and counselor said that depression is an internal temper tantrum. Prolific author, now deceased, Tim LaHaye said, the first step in the chain reaction that produces depression is anger. Manic depressed people tend to be angry people, although some of them are in denial and so don't consider themselves to be upset. Elijah's depression was due in large part to his internal anger. He was basically upset at the Israelites for not repenting from paganism that had infested the land. He was mad at Jezebel because she wanted him dead. He was angered at his nation for even permitting this woman to issue a death threat against him. Elijah was upset. Elijah was angered. And so God permitted him to vent and verbalize his anger. Now, don't miss this. There are two extremes people go to in releasing anger. Two extremes. The first extreme is called clamming up. Clamming up is the same as internalization of anger. Notice the definition. Clamming up is releasing anger's energies internally toward ourselves. Clamming up is releasing anger's energy internally toward ourselves. Have you ever met someone that gets angry and in doing so just clams up? I am married to someone that has at least once gotten upset and clammed up. And so you know, I did receive permission to share this. I don't use my wife as an illustration unless I have permission. Why? Because I have to go home. That's why. I remember one incident. I don't remember what initiated that incident. I just assume I said or I did something I probably shouldn't have. It reminds me of that philosophical thought experiment and question. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it fall, does it still make a sound? Restated in a domestic sense, it reads, if a man is left alone in the house and he says something and there isn't a woman around to hear him, is he still wrong? So it is safe to assume I said or did something wrong. But in that particular case, Hopi got so angry at me, she wouldn't speak to me. She wouldn't utter a single word. She just turned her head and walked off. I tried and tried. I begged to get her to say something, and she wouldn't. And that completely frustrated me out of my mind, which was probably the reason she was doing it. She's a sinner. She's also a saint because she puts up with me. You didn't have to respond to that. Anyway, she was clamming up, and clamming up is one means of releasing someone's anger. It is releasing anger internally and actually directing that anger inward toward ourselves, which is dangerous. It is dangerous because it can result in serious physiological consequences, from high blood pressure to shingles, to headaches, to strokes, all sorts of things. That's an extreme. There's a second form of releasing anger, which is blowing up. Not clamming up, blowing up. Notice the definition. Blowing up is releasing anger's energy externally towards something or someone else. Anger's energies are released externally towards something or someone else. There's a personality temperament profile called DISC. D-I-S-C. Some of us are familiar with DISC. 4 letters, where each letter represents a different temperament. Most people have a combination of 2 of those 4 temperaments. I actually teach a seminar on that profile, and during that seminar I give people their own personal temperament inventory to determine for themselves how God has wired them. And I do that because it's extremely interesting. And it helps us better understand ourselves. Each of these temperaments have strengths, and each of them have weaknesses. And each of us have one or more of these temperaments. On the DISC profile, I am considered a high D. High D. And according to that profile, the letter D means dominance, driving, directing, and determined. Because those are strengths, and that's good. But there are also weaknesses, because that high D temperament also means I am more susceptible to blowing up instead of clamming up. And that's not so good. Some high Ds blow up and just come unglued and scream obscenities or punch and throw things and cause actual damage to people and property. But that sort of venting anger does not solve psychological problems. That sort of release is immature and irresponsible behavior. And such childish demonstrations of anger are counterproductive. This is also the reason it isn't smart to permit a small child to throw a temper tantrum. That's blowing up on a smaller scale. Some parents do permit that behavior. I've seen a 2-year-old going nutso on the floor, beating his head against the floor and screaming. And his parents' attitude is, it's okay. He'll get tired. He just needs to work it out. No, as a parent, you need to work out his bottom. Proverbs 13, verse 24. He who spares his rod hates his son. Paraphrased as the parent that doesn't discipline his child essentially hates his child. The second half reads, but he who loves his son disciplines him promptly. We shouldn't permit temper tantrums. We have raised 3 sons. That was never permitted in private or in public. And as adults, and adults have temper tantrums. Again, temper tantrums don't solve psychological problems. Let me describe a better solution. Instead of these 2 extremes, instead of clamming up or blowing up, what needs to happen is someone releases his anger in a controlled manner through sharing his feelings with someone who understands and accepts him. One more time. Instead of climbing up or blowing up, someone releases his anger verbally in a controlled manner through sharing his feelings with someone who understands and accepts him. And that is exactly what happened to Elijah. Elijah released his anger. He verbalized his anger. He vented his frustrations and his feelings to God, who understood him and still accepted him. Someone who is discouraged and depressed needs to be able to share his emotions and feelings in a mature and responsible manner with someone else who is non-judgmental, and in this case, that someone was God. Now, please don't misunderstand this point, because most of our communication in public and in private needs to be guarded. Some psychologists argue that we should say just whatever is on our mind. But that is not wise, and it's not biblical. Some people have the attitude that if someone thinks it, then he should go ahead and say it. Not necessarily. To just say whatever we're thinking can be totally irresponsible. There is a time to be selective about what we should say and what should remain unsaid. As an example, we're at a family gathering, and Aunt Edna presents to us this embarrassing question. So, how did you like my lima bean, spam, Velveeta cheese, raspberry jello salad? The answer to that question doesn't have to be, Aunt Edna, I could be polite and speak in superficial generalities, but I want to be totally authentic with you. Right now, I am aware at the core of my being, I am experiencing the beginnings of Montezuma's revenge. Aunt Edna, what were you thinking? A lima bean, spam, Velveeta cheese, raspberry jello salad. Aunt Edna, you should be banned from the kitchen for the rest of your existence on this earth. Now, that response would be transparent and completely authentic and true, but it also would be totally inappropriate and disrespectful. So in a case like that, it's just best to be polite and superficial and say, and just not bare our soul about that salad. Instead, say something like, Aunt Edna, it was unbelievable. Unbelievable is a subjective word, and the interpretation then is in her court. But there are other times we should dare to tell someone else those things about ourselves that make us most vulnerable. That person we talk to could be our marriage partner, or could be a close friend. One of the great authors on friendship, a 12th century English abbot. An abbot was someone responsible for monks, an order of monks. This man, Alred Rivox, said that, quote, we owe love to all people, but only to a proven friend are we to entrust the secrets of the heart. The question that begs to be answered is this: is there someone that is a true enough friend that he or she knows everything about us that needs to be known? Notice, I said that needs to be known. I did not say that can be known. Is there a true friend that knows everything about us that needs to be known? I'm convinced that 99% of the population do not have a friend like that. But we need someone like that, because during a downtime and through a period of serious depression, we need to do as Elijah did and release our honest feelings to that person, no matter how embarrassing or how shameful those feelings might seem to be to us. The depressed individual that wants to open up and share his feelings and frustrations needs to know that he can sit down with someone else and share exactly what he is feeling. And that person isn't going to get upset at him or reject him or think less of him. This friend is going to accept him no matter what. Listen to how someone has defined acceptance. Acceptance means you are valuable to someone just as you are. Acceptance means you are valuable to someone just as you are. It permits you to be the real you. You aren't forced into someone else's idea of who you really are. It means your ideas are taken seriously because those ideas reflect you. You can talk about how you feel inside and why you feel that way, and someone listens and someone cares. This acceptance means you can try out your ideas without being shot down. You can even express heretical thoughts and discuss them with intelligent questioning. You feel safe. No one will pronounce judgment on you, even though that person doesn't agree with you. Now, don't misunderstand acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean you will never be corrected or never be shown to be wrong. Sometimes that is necessary, as it was in Elijah's case, as we're going to see. It simply means, acceptance means, it's safe to be you, and no one will destroy you out of prejudice. Elijah was permitted to share his feelings and share his frustrations with someone who understood him and totally accepted him. And that someone, in his case, there was no one else around. That someone happened to be God. But please notice that releasing his feelings in and of themselves was not the solutions, because feelings are not necessarily reliable. If our feelings are fickle, if our feelings are unreliable, and if our feelings are false, then it is up to the person we release our feelings to correct us. And that is precisely what God did to Elijah. Please notice that verses 15 through 18 contain a third strategy God used in the process of curing Elijah's depression. Now remember, Elijah had just vented his feelings. And how many times did Elijah tell God how he felt? He told God twice. He told God in verse 10. Did you notice? He then repeated himself in verse 14. God listened to both accounts. God was incredibly patient and listened. God did not act or react in a judgmental manner. He let Elijah share his feelings. But notice there was a third step. Please notice what God did. Since Elijah's feelings were wrong, notice what God did to correct those feelings. This is the third step in correcting or curing, I should add, curing someone's depression. Third strategy, God helped Elijah to face reality. God helped Elijah to face reality. Verse 15, and I promise I will mispronounce some of these names. Then the Lord said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Verse 16, also, you shall anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphath of Abel. Maholah you shall anoint as a prophet in your place. Verse 17, it shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill, and whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill. Now please notice verse 18. Yet, this is God correcting Elijah, yet I have reserved 7,000, meaning 7,000 men and women in Israel, in this northern kingdom, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. That last statement referred to the ancient practice of bowing down and kissing an idolatrous statue of Baal. That is what God is referencing here. And this verse means that some 8,000 Israelites had made the conscious decision not to kiss that idol and not to worship Baal. So here's the progression. God focused on Elijah's physical problems. He rejuvenated his physiological system, but that wasn't enough. It was apparent that Elijah was still depressed. He was still frustrated and unmotivated because it took him a total of 40 days to get to Horeb. So God said, Elijah, once he arrived, what is the problem? Elijah shared with him his sincere feelings and his frustrations. He vented to God. Elijah told God everything that had happened. And it was a non-judgmental environment. He felt free to do that. God permitted him to share. But the problem was Elijah's analysis of the situation was not altogether accurate. Go back to the end of verse 14, which is a repetition of verse 10. Elijah said, I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. Meaning, God, I'm it. No one else is here. and Jezebel wants me dead. This was how Elijah felt. Those were his sincere feelings, but that wasn't true. Question, was Elijah the only person left in Israel who was still committed to God? No. If we turn back a page and read 1 Kings chapter 18, we're going to meet a man named Obadiah. Obadiah had rescued 100 prophets who were still committed to God, and he personally hid those prophets in caves. Elijah was not alone. He was not the only one left. In fact, according to what we just read, in verse 18, there were another 7,000 people in Israel who were still committed to God, who refused to worship Baal and kiss his idolatrous statue. Elijah wasn't alone, but in his mind he was. And that is because in a state of depression, negative reality tends to block out positive reality. Let me repeat that. In someone's state of depression, negative reality tends to block out positive reality. Do you understand what we have a tendency to do? We tend to accent the negative and either ignore or at least minimize the positive. We tend to amplify and exaggerate the negative reality and minimize the positive reality, but that only contributes to our continued depression. Let me mention a personal example of this, because as a pastor, I'm susceptible to doing this all the time. I'm at a service, and I'm bummed because someone I had personally invited and had promised me to be here isn't here. And that depresses me. And actually, that's happened this morning. Someone that said this person would be here and isn't here, and I'm bummed about that. Now, absenteeism is a negative reality, okay? But the problem is that negative reality, if I permit it to, can block out the positive reality. And the positive reality is that there are other people that are here. In a state of depression or quasi-depression, it is possible to me to be more focused on the person that isn't there, that told me they would be there, than the people that are there. And that's not a good thing, because the people that are there then get cheated to some degree if I don't give them my fully focused and undivided attention. Bad things do happen. We understand that. And sometimes things just go from bad to worse. And that is a negative reality. But the positive reality is that if we stop and think, good things are also happening. And the fact is most often more good things are happening than bad things are happening. But if we tend to see the glass only half full, only half empty and not half full, then we might end up in a state of more severe depression because we have permitted the negative reality to block out the positive reality. Some of us resemble Elijah at this point. Some of us tend to exaggerate the negative. We mess up, get a bad grade, lose a job, blow an interview, get into financial trouble, and then start feeling like a failure. Understand something. Failing is not the same as failure. Let me repeat that. Failing is not the same as failure, because failing is not a person. Failing is an event. Failing is something that happens. In fact, failing is essential for success. I even have a book entitled Failure, the Back Door to Success. Failing doesn't make someone a failure. Just because we fail, it doesn't mean that we're a failure. But we tend to forget that and instead exaggerate the negative. And that is what Elijah did here. He felt like he was the only one left in all of Israel who was still committed to God. He felt like everyone else had turned to Baal and paganism. And so God had to help Elijah face the facts. And for the record, God is the ultimate fact checker. The fact was, Elijah wasn't the only one left. There are at least 7,000 more just like him. And in this passage we just read, God introduced him to 3 more men who were assigned to assist him: Hazael, Jehu, and Elisha. So Elijah wasn't alone. God had to correct his distorted perspective on his situation. God had to help Elijah face the positive reality. I've been pastoring as a lead pastor this month, 1/2 of a century, 50 years, 5 decades, which is hard to believe, but it's happened. And this is our 8th congregation. More and more pastors are resigning from churches. I read some across all denominational lines, non-denominational, all sorts of churches, some 1,500 pastors resign each month. Some of them never to return to a pastorate. A significant percent of pastors resign because of congregational opposition. I read an average pastor that resigns because of congregational opposition resigns because of just 8 problem people. The question is, why would someone who had been pastoring a church of hundreds, or in some cases pastoring even thousands, why would that man resign because of just 8 problem people? It is because he has a distorted perspective on his situation. He isn't facing reality. He has so distorted and so exaggerated the negative reality that he feels like the entire congregation has gotten together and ganged up against him, and that's the reason he would offer his resignation. But the fact is, his entire congregation hasn't ganged up against him. Just 8 disgruntled, dissatisfied, problem people. He needs to face the positive reality, and that is that most of his congregation is still supportive of him and is behind him. The negative reality could be that we just got laid off. But the positive reality is that heaven's employment agency can still find us another job. The negative reality could be that a relationship we thought was going somewhere just ended. But the positive reality is that God is the ultimate matchmaker, and he's more than able to find us someone else as a prospective mate for marriage. The sad and negative reality is that our friend Mike Dutton, who was a good man and a faithful member of this congregation, the past 15 years, died so soon after his cancer diagnosis. It is shocking how soon. It was just a month ago. His last service here was the first Sunday in December. That's a negative reality. Mike is not here. The positive reality is that we know with certainty that Mike is in heaven, and that is the ultimate positive reality. Christian, there are negative realities, and there are positive realities. But in a state of depression, don't permit the negative to block out the positive, but start to focus on those things that are positive so we don't give up and we don't throw in the towel. I read about a beginning journalist that lived in a small town. But one afternoon, a dam upstream broke and the town was literally flooded. He got into a rowboat and started out to find a story he could write about. He soon discovered a woman sitting on her rooftop. He tied up the boat, climbed up onto the roof himself, and told her what he was after. And then the two of them watched as different items floated by the house. As something would float by, she would say, "Now, there's a story." And he would counter, "No, actually, that's not really a story." But then something strange happened. A hat floated by. And then after about 50 feet, that hat did an abrupt 180-degree turnaround and floated back downstream another 50 feet or so. And then it did another 180-degree turnaround and floated back the 50 feet to the original point, and it did another 180-degree turnaround, and it just continued to do that back and forth and back and forth. It was as if this hat was floating in some sort of a prescribed pattern. This journalist was seeing this and was flabbergasted. He pointed to that hat that was maneuvering back and forth and said to this woman, now that is a story. And this woman said, no, no, no. That's not a story. That's my husband, Hayford. He told me that he was going to mow the yard come hell or high water. The point is to emphasize the positive reality over the negative reality, because doing that can help cure our depression. I want us to bow our heads. I want the band to come up real quickly, if you would, worship team. We're going to sing just one stanza of a song because I need to introduce some people to you to conclude our service. Father, thank you for our time. Thank you for what we've learned. We all face and struggle with depression. I pray, God, that we are now better equipped to resolve that problem called depression. I pray we will incorporate these things we have discussed, and I know we'll be better for it if we do that. So I commit this sermon to the hearts of these people. I pray your Holy Spirit will continue to work in them. And I pray and I thank you and I praise you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.